only in this country can the American dream be so great that a kid like me has the opportunity to do this.
From his Election Day victory, to his arraignment in federal court, to his expulsion from Congress.
The whole number of the House is now 434.
The reality is it's a witch hunt.
Embattled Congressman George Santos has been defiant in the face of federal charges.
Liar, liar, house on fire. Santos free, New York free.
Biographer Mark Chiusano spent the past year digging into Santos's personal and professional life, hoping to lift the veil of lies surrounding the former congressman. Hello, and welcome to Newsday TV studios in Melville, and to our conversation with Mark Chiusano, who literally wrote the book on former Congressman George Santos. In the book, The Fabulist, you compare Mr. Santos to Elizabeth Holmes and Anna Delvey. Mark, why?
Well, I think when I was writing the book, it sort of occurred to me that the sort of best con men and con women, I guess, gravitate towards a particular field that's indicative of their times, right? So you have someone like Frank Abagnale, right, who is the Catch Me If You Can con man, right? And he's kind of drawn to jet travel at this moment when that is, you know, the premier kind of cultural thing that people are thinking about. Obviously, he made up that whole story too. But similar with Elizabeth Holmes and Anna Delvey, right? They are sort of remembered. They're kind of like icons of conning because they did their sort of cons in this field of the moment. And I kind of think that's why people are so fascinated with Santos, is because he comes around and does his sort of scheming in the world of politics at this moment when politics is sort of everything in culture.
Let me ask you this. Given your research into the rise of George Santos, was his fall predictable?
I think eventually he had to fall, right? And he's looking at significant legal challenges ahead, and certainly he's already out of Congress. So the fall has kind of commenced, right? But his whole life he was kind of walking this real tightrope. In the book, I write about how when he's living in Brazil, he has this kind of scheme going with his own grandmother. He's sort of mooching off his grandmother early on. So it's kind of a pattern with Santos. He's always been sort of doing these kind of low-level hustles, schemes, etc. And I think he just kind of continued that into his political life, where it got even zanier. Well,
you know, now he's a historic figure. And he had a compelling American story, which we're going to get into at some point in time. I mean, he is the first child of Brazilian immigrants elected to Congress from Long Island. He is the first openly gay man elected to Congress from Long Island, and the first Latino elected to Congress from Long Island. And you mentioned his mom. She came to the U.S. She picked beans and squash at the very beginning. Do you think that Santos, given his charisma, given everything, could have succeeded without the lies?
I think so. This is sort of, I almost wish we'd had this experiment, right? Where if he hadn't been kicked out and if he hadn't said he wasn't running, he would have actually had to go in front of voters again, right? Next year. And that would have been fascinating because he sort of benefited from this red wave, a kind of a tailwind that sort of boosted him into office. And I wonder if that wind is still blowing, you know? I mean, one of my favorite sort of numbers in the book is that Chuck Schumer, you know, incredible local campaigner, guy who's like indefatigable, lost in this district, right, when Santos won. So I think that gives a sense of the kind of anti-democratic energy that was in the district that Santos really, really benefited from.
All right, so let's take it a step further. Suppose voters knew everything about Santos that we know now. Given the red wave, could he have still won?
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between the sort of lying and the grifting, you know? And if it was just kind of making up a background for himself, where he's a guy who didn't go to the colleges he said he went to, you know, wasn't actually Jewish, things like that. I do wonder if voters would say, this guy's goofy and hilarious, but he votes the way we want him to, meaning conservative, very conservative Republican. I wonder, though, if as more and more came out about the hustles he was pulling, particularly even on campaign donors, right, pocketing campaign money, I don't know that that would sit so well with normal Long Islanders.
What does his election, we've talked a lot about him and how he got there, but what does that say about Long Island voters, if anything?
I think that they were, they really wanted to register complaints about Democrats, right, on Long Island, but also in New York more generally, right? Santos is sort of an interesting figure to me because he was both the beneficiary of this red wave, right, but also kind of stirring the pot more than some other Republicans were. One of my favorite scenes in the book is when he's kind of standing on the side of the road in the snow, helping out at this anti-mask protest, right? He's yelling at cars, like, take the masks off our kids. So these are the kinds of things these were the cultural trends that he was both benefiting from and kind of pushing himself.
Well, you also mentioned in the book that at the beginning of COVID, he was a very, very careful guy.
He was, and this is, no surprise to voters, right, that he is a bit of a flip-flopper on some things, right? He talked about how getting COVID was sort of one of the most intense experiences of his life. He was apparently, calling out for his mother who'd been dead for years. That's how kind of sick he was. And there's this great video of him walking to a hospital in Queens to get retested, right? And he's outdoors, but he's wearing his mask really tightly fitted over his nose. So he took it seriously. And then things start shifting, right? He understands that the Republican mainstream is sort of moving against these kind of COVID mitigation efforts. And so he starts saying, no mask, no vax, et cetera.
You write a lot, actually, about his charisma. In fact, you say he was good at filling emptiness. He could fill whole rooms. Is that what made him so great at crafting credible falsehoods?
I think so. I mean, if you're the kind of person who doesn't mind silence and doesn't mind, not being the center of attention, then you're happy just kind of listening or being present or whatever. But for someone like Santos, he kind of seems to have wanted that spotlight, right? And to get it, he would sort of say the craziest things, right? I mean, his volleyball story, which seemed to kind of come out of almost nowhere, even his sort of Jewish fabrications. These things, he didn't need to say them. They didn't even really sort of boost him that definitively, and yet he just kind of seemed to fill the space.
So you say it was a want. Was it a need?
I think so. I think that he, since early in his life, I write about how he was the kind of center of attention in his family. At one point, he was, the oldest boy, focus of this whole immigrant family in Queens, and he seems to want something greater. I talked to some people at the middle school that he went to who said he would even come up after class and say to a teacher, what can I do to get ahead? This was the kind of thing that he was kind of focused on. He had serious ambition. And when he was blocked in his ambitions, he started lying.
Let's talk about his marriage. It was pretty interesting pretty early on. He had presented himself as the first openly gay man running in a race with another openly gay man for Congress. And then it comes out that he at one point in time had a marriage. And you write in the book about this. So even his marriage was a scam?
So this is what's so interesting about his marriage, and what was fun in the book is kind of sorting through all the things that he said. He's described this marriage lots of different ways. When he was working at this kind of dreary call center in Queens, he said that it was a bit of a trust fund situation, and he needed to get married in order to have access to the trust fund. That was not accurate. But what I reported was that there was money involved. Multiple people told me that he was paid tens of thousands of dollars to do this marriage, right? A sort of what we would understand as a green card marriage, a way perhaps for a woman to get citizenship. And And he's sort of denied this, and the woman hasn't spoken to reporters. But if you kind of look at the timeline, he was working a kind of what we would think of as a regular job, maybe a somewhat stable kind of 9-to-5-ish job. And then he marries this woman, and he leaves that place. And this is kind of a bit of the launch of a new life for him, where he's doing kind of low-level, different kind of schemes to make money rather than working at this call center.
Well, you actually quote someone in the book as saying that he told them, you could get 30 grand like I did.
30 grand, yeah, that's the number.
30 grand. So one of the many revelations in the book is this interesting thing about that 2022 was not the first time George Santos went to Washington, and he went through the new member orientation, which is kind of bizarre.
Strange. This is election night, 2020. He loses, right? Everyone knew he lost. But he says, no, I won, I'm going down there. And he goes, and he has a great time. He goes to all the kind of, events, parties, dinners, these kinds of things. And it's a kind of amazing experience, I've been told, for members who go down there, political people who sort of, go to these events. They try to impress you. It's supposed to be like your like freshman orientation to college, They want you to have a good time. And so it seems that he had a really good time, and he decided that this is the kind of thing he wanted to continue. He also realized that he could make money off this kind of thing, right? Immediately after that election, he opens this new campaign committee, which is for a recount, right? The recount never happened. Again, he lost by over 12 percentage points, but he starts raising money, lots of money, spending it in weird ways as well. So I think he saw that even though he lost, politics could be this great place. And I remember calling him, the day that he was officially, the BOE said, it's over. Board of Elections says you lost. And I said to him, what do you think? Are you coming home now? He was still in D.C. at the time. And he said, yes, he was getting on a train, but he promised that he was going to be running again in 2 years. And he did.
In your book, you describe Washington as the, quote, perfect place for a status-conscious person interested in performance, storytelling, money, and messiness. How then did Santos do as a lawmaker? How do you do?
He didn't do much, right? He didn't get bills passed. He had difficulty getting any sort of support at all for his legislation. He did, though, try, right? He threw out lots of ideas, some of them somewhat trolly, right? They didn't seem to be serious legislation meant to actually pass. That included a law on vaccines that he named after Nicki Minaj, the rapper, who was known for kind of promoting vaccine conspiracy theories. So this was the kind of thing that he was doing. It's very different than what other, for example, Long Island members of Congress have done when they went to Congress, right? Typically, the idea is that you kind of keep your head down. You maybe find one issue you want to work on. You support your colleagues, things like that. This was not the tack that Santos took when he got to D.C.
One constituent of his in the third sent me an email saying Santos had committed fraud to be elected. Fraud's a legal term. How would you describe his ascent? It's not fraud, can't be.
No, I think it's a matter of kind of putting on different costumes, right, over time, and sometimes those costumes helped boost him, right? Take, for example, the sort of Jewish fabrications. This is one of the most fun parts about my book, was kind of digging into what's real and what's not real in these things, right? He has claims that, yes, indeed, he does have Jewish heritage. And so I said, okay, I'm a journalist. I'm going to try to figure out what's real and what's not. So I, find a genealogist who goes kind of all the way back and says that, perhaps in the 1700s, there's an ancestor of his that had a Jewish-sounding name. We're really giving him the benefit of the doubt. But what's not true is that, his grandparents fled the Holocaust. That's not true at all. Yet he said these things in front of, two reporters at Jewish outlets. He said them at a fundraiser that was full of prospective Jewish donors. And he kind of used this idea of heritage to sort of establish a common bond. And that is, I don't know if that's fraudulent, but certainly it's a little sneaky.
Well, in Brazil, people saw him for what he was. Here, people didn't see him for what he was. How do you explain the difference?
I think that in America, it's a very American idea to be kind of constantly reinventing yourself, right? And so he follows in a long tradition. I think there's a funny irony that, our best kind of fictional person person who like kind of changes the story of their lives, the Great Gatsby, right? Is a person who was written to have lived in Santos's district, So there is something about this American world, about this kind of New York, Long Island universe that maybe is home to people who are strivers, who want to kind of live a better life, and they can see that better life, right? There's lots of opportunities here, but when they can't get it, sometimes they sort of start trying different things.
And we couldn't detect this.
Yeah, I mean, Santos was not sort of totally unknown when he was running. He'd run twice. There had been pieces written about him. I wrote about him, some of the weird things about him. Other outlets kind of looked into him as well. And so, he was a person who was had holes poked into him. The problem is that we didn't connect the dots all the way, right? It's different when you have someone who's lying about one or two things, which is kind of typical, versus someone who's lying about everything, and it's all a house of cards.
Well, let's go back to your book again. You wrote, Santos saw that you could say anything on the political stage, and they hardly fact-check it, and that was absolutely, positively, 1,000% true. Are you seeing any result of the changes as a result of those failures?
I think that we're all kind of doing more checks, in local media, right? There's been some great reporting into other members of Congress and their misrepresentations. I don't think we've really seen another person like Santos. I think that we maybe are in like a moment, a little bubble of more scrutiny, which is great. But if American history tells us anything, it's that this kind of thing goes in waves. And, we'll probably see another scammer rise and probably not get detected, especially in this kind of internet era.
Well, let's take them one by one. Apathy. You say apathy was a cause.
Mm-hmm.
We're going into a national election. You think apathy is going to stay?
I think that national elections, presidential elections, are always the ones that draw the most attention, right? But it is looking more and more likely that it's going to be the same presidential candidates from last time around. That's not usually a recipe for enormous attention, right? And then there's thousands of races other than the presidential one. And I think the more attention that we can be paying to those other races, the better.
You write about gatekeepers' blunders. There was, he went through a vetting system.
To call it vetting is not, he didn't get sort of significantly vetted, right? But we should say though, again, with this idea of the house of cards, lots of people found lots of weird things about him. Even the Democrats, the sort of campaign arm for congressional Democrats who were supposed to be looking into him, kind of typically do this kind of research, they found a ton of really embarrassing stuff about him, including his strange pet charity, which was not even really a charity. It seemed like he was making money off it. The problem, again, was that the dots weren't connected, and it wasn't clear that he was lying about everything. And there was a focus also on his extreme political positions rather than some of his strange biographical.
Quick question, is there anything he didn't lie about?
Is there anything he didn't lie about? I do think that he mostly has these conservative beliefs. I think that there's been some question of, he's actually a closet Democrat. And it's true that in the beginning he would say things like, I'm no right-winger, and maybe he would modulate on some issues. But his family, I write in the book, is deeply religious and mostly conservative, longtime supporters of Jair Bolsonaro, the former Brazilian president, who's very, very conservative. So I think that has been mostly a constant in his life.
You also write about weak penalties for faking. We're going to see any change there? I mean, he was voted out.
He was voted out. We haven't really seen many changes in terms of the campaign finance penalties, right? The Federal Election Commission is kind of in charge of governing these kinds of things and doesn't have a lot of teeth, right? This has kind of been a problem for years. And so lots of candidates, not just Santos, sort of assume that they can, mostly, file their disclosures and come up to the, come close to following the law, but, sometimes also do things that they're not supposed to, and they'll assume that they won't be found out.
You repeatedly go back to a theme in your book about what you call Mr. Santos's need to, quote, scrounge up cash. Okay,
He's always looking for money.
He lost a paycheck. He's not going to get that pension. He's not going to get those health care benefits. But I think you know that he's making money right now, right?
He is making a lot of money on, right now, it's Cameo, which is this service where you can kind of, pay for a video from Santos, which is a little shout out, And, the reporting has been that he's making close to what his congressional salary was.
If not more.
If not more, just off these cameos. So.
He still has federal charges to deal with. We're going to be back. We're going to see him again in federal court in not too distant future. And then there's a trial in 2024. Mm-hmm. So he's not going anywhere right now.
That's right. It's possible he takes a plea deal, but he's lost his biggest bargaining chip, which was being in office, right? So I think that we're at a kind of goofy moment of the story now where there's the Cameo situation and he's looking at other hustles, different ways to make money, but he has real legal challenges ahead, and that's not going to be so easy to brush aside.
Now, The Fabulist, I read, is being picked up by HBO as a, quote, dark comedy.
That's right.
All right. Now, let's talk a bit about the dark part of this, and this is from the constituents of the 3rd District and other people who say they were cheated. I mean, I've seen Rich Ostroff, right? He was a veteran who raised money for his dog, beloved dog. Santos took the money and the dog died. That was Sapphire. And just last week, I talked to a village mayor who says that they didn't get infrastructure funds because Mr. Santos didn't do what the mayor thought that Mr. Santos should have done. There are very real implications of him for his district. What insight did you get into that?
I think that he was not so interested in governing, or even being a member of Congress, the work of it, right? He was most interested in kind of the benefits that he could accrue monetarily and also kind of fame-wise. And he has never been a super hard worker other than for himself.
Well, I read today that he said of himself, congressional people who maybe do this, who did all this, they're never going to be remembered. I'm the guy who's going to be remembered. In your view, should he be asterisked and forgotten, or should he be remembered? And if so, why?
I think he should be remembered as this kind of, first of all, wild, entertaining, surprising, colorful individual, right? Another great Long Island story, right? We have tons of great Long Island figures, and he's now added to the list. So that's part of it. But I do think he's important to remember as a political figure and a little bit of a warning for where our politics is going, right? That someone like this can both win, but also keep the seat for a while and kind of avoid being pushed out immediately, right? He's the kind of guy that in an earlier era would not have lasted at all in Congress. But I think his sort of staying power says something about our system. The fact that GOP leadership, didn't vote to push him out, right, says something about where we are in Congress right now. And so it's a little bit of a warning to see where we go. Are we going to see more people like this? Are we going to see more sort of cynicism and scheming in Congress? Or are we going to kind of make a turn?
Thank you, Mark, for joining us at Newsday Studios. And thank you for joining us for our conversation on uncovering Santos.